Isaiah chapter 4 and chapter 5. As we begin reading here in chapter 4, I think I'll read the whole chapter, all 6 verses. And then I'll begin my study by making some commentary on those verses. Then we'll move into chapter 5. Beginning at verse 1, chapter 4, Isaiah writes, "And in that day 7 women shall take hold of one man, saying, We will eat our own food and wear our own apparel. Only let us be called by your name to take away our reproach. In that day the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth shall be excellent and appealing for those of Israel who have escaped. It shall come to pass that he who is left in Zion and he who remains in Jerusalem will be called holy, everyone who is recorded among the living in Jerusalem. When the Lord has washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and purged the blood of Jerusalem from her midst, by the spirit of judgment and by the spirit of burning, then the Lord will create above every dwelling place of Mount Zion and above her assemblies a cloud and smoke by day, the shining of a flaming fire by night. For over all the glory there will be a covering, and there will be a tabernacle for shade in the daytime from the heat, for a place of refuge, and for a shelter from storm and rain." Now remember with me as we enter into our study that in chapter 3, the prophet Isaiah had been prophesying that judgment would befall the Jews. Now some of what he had to say had partial fulfillment through the Babylonians and the Assyrians. But other portions of his prophecy were to be completely fulfilled in the last times. Now in chapter 3, he had described the conditions that would exist. He said that God would judge every element of Jewish society, that God would judge the military, the political, the religious, even the cultural aspects of the society. And as we concluded chapter 3, we looked at the strong words that he had to speak to the daughters of Zion, or the women of Israel. Remember with me that their affluence had given way to pride, and they had become caught up with their outer appearance. They had actually become sexually active and no longer exerted moral influence in their society. And as a result, God said that he would take away their beauty and replace it with disgrace. So as we enter into chapter 4, he actually is continuing what he's been saying in chapter 3. So the first verse actually goes with what was being stated in chapter 3. That's why it says, "in that day." In that day is what he is speaking about in chapter 3. In that day, 7 women shall take hold of one man, saying, We will eat our own food and wear our own apparel. Only let us be called by your name to take away our reproach. And so Isaiah is continuing his prophecy. And the fact is, war has destroyed the male population, and there's no longer an abundance of men. And so the ratio, according to verse 1, is now 7 women to 1 man. That's not too bad. And the bottom line is the women have become desperate for a husband. Now I know that doesn't sit well with 21st century women who don't need men. But you need to understand something. You need to understand that in the Jewish culture, it was a disgrace to be unmarried. It was a reproach to be childless. And so for them, when they're grabbing hold of the only available males, they're even saying to them, look, you don't have to do anything other than give us your name. You don't have to even support us. We'll take care of ourselves. All we're asking for is to be married to you. Now, for some in our society today, that sounds odd because there's very little value for marriage, and there's even less for raising children. And for some, the only thing required to have a child is that they might somehow locate someone who will be what we call today, and what has been called today, a donor. And so there are those who don't really care if they're married. They don't even care if they're married to have the children and all. As a matter of fact, they don't even need to know the man who impregnates them. They can just go and get some donor to contribute to them. They can have their babies. But in Israel, marriage was recognized as honorable, and it was a reproach to be unmarried. In the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews, in chapter 13, at verse 4, God said, marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. Now, I find it interesting today, and I'm not going to this really isn't the heart of my message, so I'll just touch on it briefly. I find it interesting that today there are very many people, including Christians, who really don't honor the marriage bed, who really don't recognize that God established marriage. And I find it interesting to note that some people have gone so far as to believe that living together constitutes marriage. But God never recognized it that way, guys. And if we're going to agree with anybody, I think it's wise that we agree with the way that the Lord established things. And so God established marriage, and God intends marriage to be something that is for the benefit of man and for its society. And so the marriage bed is honorable, the Scripture says, and is undefiled. But he says, but the people who are committing sexual sin are going to be judged by God. That's a very strong word, and it isn't something invented by some man. It was given to us by God. You see, the psalmist tells us in Psalm 127, verse 3, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is a reward. Now, some of us would argue with that sometimes because of our children. But it is really a blessing, isn't it? Those of us who are parents, it is a blessing to have children. And God says, I've given you children as a heritage. And so in the Jewish society, marriage is honorable and having children is honorable. It's something that people desired. And yet what is taking place is because of war and its devastation, and we had seen that in chapter 3. Notice in verse 25, chapter 3, he had said, your men shall fall by the sword and your mighty in the war. Because there are so many casualties in war, the ratio of woman to man has gone 7 women to 1 man, and therefore because they want the reproach removed, during this time, they actually are grabbing hold of men and saying, look, marry me, just give me your name, and I'll take care of the rest for myself. So he's describing a very bad time that'll take place in the latter days. Notice in verse 2, he says, in that day the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth shall be excellent and appealing for those of Israel who have escaped. And it shall come to pass that he who is left in Zion and he who remains in Jerusalem will be called holy, everyone who is recorded among the living in Jerusalem. When the Lord has washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and purged the blood of Jerusalem from her midst by the spirit of judgment and by the spirit of burning, then the Lord will create above every dwelling place of Mount Zion and above her assemblies a cloud and smoke by day and the shining of a flaming fire by night. For over all the glory there will be a covering, and there will be a tabernacle for shade in the daytime from the heat, for a place of refuge and for shelter from storm and rain. So when he goes on and says, in that day, that gives to us an insight what he's speaking about. Though God is going to bring judgment and sin will be dealt with, he is not abandoning them forever. That's the point that he's making. He is not abandoning them forever. Because God's final purpose for the nation is not destruction. Remember in the book of Hosea, if you're taking notes, it's Hosea chapter 11, verse 8. Remember how God is speaking to the nation of Israel, and this is what he says. He says, how can I give you up, Ephraim? And how can I hand you over, Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I set you like Zeboim? And he goes on to say, my heart churns within me, my sympathy is stirred. Now, Ephraim and Israel, Ephraim is another name for the nation of Israel. Admah and Zeboim are names you probably have not really heard of, or perhaps you've heard of and can't really recall where you heard of them from. Admah and Zeboim are 2 of the cities that were destroyed with Sodom and Gomorrah. And that's what God is saying. How can I destroy you the way I destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah and the small cities surrounding it? How can I give you up? As a matter of fact, when we studied through the book of Hosea and we had arrived at chapter 11, as you read that passage, I shared it with you, those of you who are with us. It's been several years now, and I shared it with you, and there's a passion in the voice of God. Because he's saying, like a child, I taught Israel how to walk. I took you by the hands, and I encouraged you and showed you your first steps. But those steps that you were taking were away from me. And as a result, I've had to judge you. And though Israel's sin was so tremendous, God says, but then how can I give you up? I can't. My heart churns within me because I love you and I have a covenant with you. And so this is God's heart here as we're looking at it in the book of Isaiah. God doesn't want to destroy them forever, but God has to deal with sin. Now when it says in verse 2, in that day the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, the branch of the Lord is another way of speaking for the Messiah. The branch of the Lord is another phrase for Jesus Christ. It's another name, the branch. Remember those who studied Jeremiah with me in Jeremiah 23, verse 5? how the scripture says, the days are coming, saith the Lord, that I will raise to David a branch of righteousness. A king shall reign and prosper, execute judgment and righteousness in the earth. In Jeremiah 33:15, in those days and at that time, I will cause to grow up to David a branch of righteousness. He shall execute judgment and righteousness in the earth. This is another name for Messiah. And so when you're looking at verse 2, and it says, in that day the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, it gives us insight that this is a time when Jesus Christ, Messiah, is reigning. And so after the famine that we saw in chapter 3, and after we see the destruction through war, the point he's making is Messiah will come and restore fruitfulness to Israel. In verse 3, he says, it shall come to pass that he who is left in Zion, and he who remains in Jerusalem, will be called holy. And so his rule shall be both spiritually and physically fruitful. Spiritually, because he's ruling over them in a spiritual manner, and justice and righteousness is going to rule and reign. And fruitful in a physical way, because after all the famine and destruction, now he's going to restore the earth and it's going to produce abundantly. And men are going to be taught by God. And they're going to understand that God is the one supplying their daily needs and that they're not taking care of themselves. See, that's the great problem that Israel had, and that's a problem that many people have today, is we fail to give glory and thanks to God for the benefits that we have. We receive from the hand of the Lord things that we take for granted. We receive from the hand of the Lord air to breathe and water to drink, and everything beyond that, and we take it for granted. And Israel had gotten to the point in their history, and in the end times will once again do so, where they began to believe that it was through their own power, their own wisdom, their own strength, their own abilities, that they were blessed, that they had all of these things. And I've mentioned to you, when you go to Israel, you're going to discover that that mentality is present, is prevalent in Israel even to this day, where they will say, God didn't deliver us, we have delivered ourselves. We have brought ourselves up. We have done it for ourselves. That's the overwhelming mentality in the nation of Israel. But they're going to be taught, and they're going to learn that it's God who supplies their every need. Another Old Testament prophet by the name of Ezekiel, in chapter 34, verses 26 and 27, says this. He said, I will make them and the places all around my hill a blessing, and I will cause showers to come down in their season. There shall be showers of blessing. The trees of the field shall yield their fruit, and the earth shall yield her increase. They shall be safe in their land. They shall know that I am the Lord when I have broken the bands of their yoke and delivered them from the hand of those who enslaved them. And so God is going to train them and teach them. In verses 4 through 6, when he speaks about the Lord washing away the filth of the daughters of Zion, the tribulation comes to mind here, because God is going to bring his judgment and he will cleanse the nation. And like in the wilderness experience, as they had the pillar of fire and the cloud, even so God's presence will once again be evident both day and night. And he speaks concerning the tabernacle having a canopy. I want you to see verses 5 and 6. It says, the Lord will create above every dwelling place of Mount Zion and above her assemblies a cloud and smoke by day and the shining of a flaming fire by night. For over all the glory there will be a covering. There will be a tabernacle for shade in the daytime from the heat, for a place of refuge and for shelter from storm and rain. It's a picture of a covering. It's like a wedding canopy that will protect the people of the city from the natural elements. So God is establishing once again a relationship with the nation of Israel. He's saying to them, you at one time were relying on yourself. Now you will rely on me. And like a husband who is taking care of his bride, even on the wedding day and further on, even so I will care for you. I will be with you in the daytime, and I will be with you in the nighttime, and I will provide blessings for you. And you will learn to depend on me. And no longer will you be running away from me, but you will be living with and loving me. Now moving into chapter 5, continuing, he now gives to us an illustration of a vineyard. This is a song. And so don't worry, I won't sing it, but this is a song. And this is what he says, beginning at verse 1. Now let me sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved regarding his vineyard. My well-beloved has a vineyard on a very fruitful hill. He dug it up and cleared out its stones and planted it with the choicest vine. He built a tower in its midst and also made a winepress in it. So he expected it to bring forth good grapes, but it brought forth wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge please between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done to my vineyard that I have not done in it? Why then, when I expected it to bring forth good grapes, did it bring forth wild grapes? And now please, let me tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away its hedge, and it shall be burned. Break down its wall, it shall be trampled down. I will lay it waste, it shall not be pruned or dug. There shall come up briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain on it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant plant. He looked for justice, but behold, oppression, for righteousness, but behold, weeping. This is kind of like a protest song. As he speaks here, he gives to us some insight into what is taking place in the nation. And he wants people to know, as he's singing this song, that he exerted great care, time, and attention to a vineyard. But it yielded useless grapes. And as you look at these 7 verses, notice with me his care that he's telling us that he had given to the nation. Notice he says that he dug it up and he cleared out its stones. Digging up the vineyard and clearing the stones is what anybody knows to be backbreaking work. Anybody here who ever goes into their backyard, and say you live in an area like Upland has a lot of rocks and stony in a lot of ways, and say you're trying to do some work out there, and you have all of these rocks that are hidden just below the surface, that's what he's talking about. He said, I saw a beautiful hill, and it looked like it would produce abundantly, so I put a lot of time and effort into this. I went to the hill, and I began to dig out the rocks. As I dug out the rocks, I put them in a pile, and then I used those piles to build a wall of safety and security around my vineyard. And then after doing that, he says, I planted the best vine. Now, normally, a wait of around 2 years was necessary in order for it to produce fruit. So he not only plants the best, but he also has patience for it to produce. Then 30 says, I built a tower in its midst. In other words, in order to guard the crops from marauders or pests, in order that I might show it constant attention, I remained with it and took care of it. Next thing he says, in expectation of its abundance, I built a wine press. Now, a wine press, we know what a wine press is. It's where the grapes are pressed into juice and it becomes the wine. And normally what they would do, because this was on a hill, he had 2 vats, one for the pressing of the grape. Then there'd be a trough that would lead downhill to a second vat so that the juice from that which was being pressed would run down into it. And so he set it up, and it's getting ready, in other words, for him to be able to have some product. But all his work is fruitless because wild grapes overran the choice grapes. And so I did all of this work. I took care of you. I patiently waited for you to produce fruit. But as a result of all of this, the only thing I've seen come from your nation has been injustice. Now, in verses 3 and 4, he says, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. So this is now a picture of a courtroom, and Israel is being put on trial. And God is now witnessing against them. And he says in verse 5, please let me tell you what I'll do to my vineyard. In other words, I'm going to abandon the project, I'm going to remove my hedge of protection from it, and I'm going to destroy it. He says, I will no longer bring rain on it. Now remember with me, rain is a symbol of God's grace. So he's saying, I am no longer going to be pouring my grace on the nation, but rather, because I looked for justice and righteousness and found nothing, I am going to bring judgment on them. And so when he says in verse 7, the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, he lets us know what he's talking about. He's simply saying this. He's saying, I have cared for that nation. I was the one who began that nation. I called Abraham when he was still a pagan. And I told him to enter into a land that I would show him and I would bless him. And from that point on, there has been a history in this nation of rebellion and rejection. And so he's basically saying, so now after I've protected, cared for it, and been with that nation, I am now removing the hedge of protection, and judgment is about to fall. And that's what he's saying in verse 7 when he says, the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel. The men of Judah are his pleasant plant. He looked for justice, behold, oppression, righteousness, but behold, weeping. And now we enter into the woes of Isaiah. You ready? Here we go. And nobody can say, whoa. In verses 8 through 10, woe to those who join house to house, who add field to field till there's no place where they may dwell alone in the midst of the land. In my hearing, the Lord of hosts said, truly many houses shall be desolate, great and beautiful ones without inhabitant. For 10 acres of vineyard shall yield 1 bath, and a homer of seed shall yield 1 ephah. Now, what is he speaking about here? And we're going to take these woes one at a time, or a grouping of them. In verses 8 through 10, he's speaking about the greed and the self-indulgence of the nation, and it's pictured by land grabbing. He's saying, you have purchased lands. Now remember with me that in the nation of Israel, the land is actually a gift from God to the people, but he retains ownership of it. And what is happening is people are beginning to buy up other people's property that is really their right. That's their right of inheritance. As a matter of fact, in the nation of Israel, if I got to the point where I was financially destitute and I had to do something to get some money, I could sell my field to a neighbor, but in what is called the year of Jubilee, which comes every 50 years, that neighbor had to give that land back to my family because it belonged to me as an inheritance. And so I could actually put myself in an indentured servant's position and I could work for them. But when the year of Jubilee came, it was to go back to my family. Why? Because God was saying to the nation of Israel that my blessings are going to be for you to have this land of the nation. And so he's saying what you're doing is you're actually buying up everybody's land and you're making them into indentured servants. You're not giving them justly their wages and all, and you become land barons. And the sin that he's speaking about is the sin of greed. And he's saying that the nation is filled with it. Oppression and injustice is what is taking place in the nation of Israel. So he's speaking about self-indulgence, and it's pictured by land grabbing. Now, when he says, and I want you to see this, when he says in verse 9, in my hearing, the Lord of hosts said, truly, many houses shall be desolate, great and beautiful ones without inhabitant. I did some ministry a couple of weeks ago in San Jose. And on the way to San Jose, I took the coastal route. And some of you have been up into the area of Monterey and Carmel. And they have something called the 17-mile drive. I don't know if you've seen that. How many of you have seen that? The 17? Okay, you've seen it. You know, I'm looking at these homes that are incredible. I've never seen such large homes in my life, you know. And I'm driving through it, and I'm looking at these incredible homes right there on the bluffs overlooking the beautiful beach and all. And I think Carmel, Monterey area is one of the most beautiful places in California. And so I was interested, you know, I wonder how much these houses go for. And it just so happens I had a newspaper that told me how much those homes went for. You know how much they go for? $21 million. So I bought 2. $21 million, my goodness. I mean, that is beyond me. A house, $21 million? And then I was watching TV when I got back, and there's a house in Beverly Hills that was for sale that has a servant's quarters on its property. The servant's quarter is 4,000 square feet. I applied for a job. 4,000 square feet. Servant's quarters. It's a guest house. And the house that was for sale, $29 million. And so they asked, what do you have to be making a year to qualify for this house? And the salesman said, $100 million a year. You have to be making $100 million a year to qualify to buy this $29 million house. And I'm only looking at it from the outside. I'm looking at it on the TV screen, but that is so beyond me. But listen, it's not that unusual in prosperous times for people to go out and make sure they get enough that they can get with their money. I want you to think about that for a minute. Now, I was listening to Dobson the other day, and he said something that really struck me. He said this. He said, you know, he said, in the day that we're living in, the United States is most prosperous now than it's ever been in its history. Perhaps some of you heard Dobson saying that. I don't listen to him all the time. I just happened to turn this program on. So James Dobson was saying that. He was interviewing somebody, and they were speaking about something or other. I don't know. I had just turned it on when I heard Dr. Dobson making that comment. He said, we live in the United States in the most prosperous moment of its history. He said, that's true. We had a bump about 6 months ago. He says, we've recovered as a nation and we're pressing forward. And he says, we have more discretionary cash now than we ever have. And this is the question he asked that struck my heart. He said, but where is the generosity of the believer? That's a good question. Because we have to be careful ourselves, guys, that we don't begin to hoard to ourselves that which really belongs to the Lord. Because God is opposed to greed. And a lot of people, including Christians, can be exceptionally greedy and hoard to themselves things because they're putting money away for a rainy day, or they're purchasing more properties in the event that something should fall here. I've got my money in real estate and it's going to collect some interest over the years because equity always builds up in land, and that's the way we think. And so that was one of the sins, interestingly enough, in the nation of Israel, that they had prospered to the point where they were able to start purchasing land and joining land to land, is what he's saying, and they became land barons. And as a result of that, they stopped trusting in God to produce and provide for them, and they began to trust in themselves. Now, there's a lot of Americans who trust in their credit cards. You know, in Visa, I trust. And there's this mentality, and a lot of Americans actually do that, don't they? And they get themselves into this incredible credit card debt. And some of us receive these come-ons. You get these come-ons once in a while, don't you? Where it says join or get our card, you know, and we don't have a yearly fee, and we'll give you 0%. All you need to do is send the balance from another card to us. And then read the fine print, and it says if you are even a minute too late, then we're going to go back to the prevailing rate plus. And then you end up, like you think you're getting a deal. You're not getting a deal, because if you're 1 day late, you end up losing that 0%. You end up with 19.8 or beyond that, and now you're hooked by this particular credit card company. And what do? You wait for somebody else to send you a new card, and then you just transfer the funds that you have over there to this one over here. And what do? We borrow from Peter to pay Paul, and we end up over our heads in credit card debt. And we're doing that because we're trusting in the dollar and not in our God. And I've learned something. I've learned that if you put God's kingdom first and your finances are given to Him, then your budget finds a way to be straightened out. But when we're not taking care of the things of the Lord first, we end up paying more for ourselves, and we end up ripping God off. And God said that's the sin of greed. And He said the nation was doing that. In verse 8, woe to those who join house to house, who add field to field, till there's no place where they may dwell alone in the midst of the land. But He says, I'm going to be bringing a crash. In verse 10, it says, 10 acres of vineyard shall yield 1 bath. A homer of seed shall yield 1 ephah. And so when He's speaking about that, He's actually just speaking concerning the fact that their houses are going to be abandoned and their fields will cease producing fruit. When He says 10 acres will yield, let's see how He says it again. 10 acres of vineyard shall yield 1 bath. He's saying 10 acres will yield 6 gallons of wine. When He speaks of a homer of seed, that's 6.5 bushels or 209 quarts. 209 quarts of seed will produce 21 quarts of grain. So He's saying you're going to be working and working and working, but getting nothing in return. I'm bringing judgment. Now, verses 11 and 12, He gives a second woe. He says, woe to those who rise early in the morning, that they may follow intoxicating drink, who continue until night, till wine inflames them. The harp and the strings, the tambourine and the flute, and wine are in their feasts. Now notice, but they do not regard the work of the Lord, nor consider the operation of His hands. What are you saying, Isaiah? Isaiah is saying, I'm speaking against those who have a party lifestyle. They're not working, so they drink all day. They rise up in the morning and begin drinking, and they drink until the night when they can join together with some of their friends and party. That's what He's talking about when He's in verse 12 saying the harp, strings, tambourine, and flute. He's saying we've got a musical group there that we're partying to. And the result of that, and I want you to see this, is they do not regard the work of the Lord nor consider the operation of His hands. The result of that is that they have just basically cast God out of their lifestyle. These are people who, live to party. And that was taking place in prophetic view then, and it's now. It's now. And you know what? It's not just 2001 either, is it? I got saved in 1970. And I can tell you, and I was 20 years old, and I can tell you I lived to party. Every day I would look for something to drink. And some of you know what I'm talking about. Others don't, and thank God that you don't. But I would wake up in the morning looking for something to drink. I wanted something to drink because I was in bondage to the alcohol. And there was no problem at all. And some of you know this for yourself. You came through this too. For me to drink a beer in the morning was normal. It was all right. And to continue all day with it was fine too. And then to have a group of friends later on that I was hanging with that we could play some music and drink some more or whatever, that's the point He's making here. But what is the fruit of it? He says they don't regard God because they're so into their money and they're partying that God has no place in their lifestyle. And that's an absolute truth, isn't it? Because as long as you're into gaining money and drinking all the time and partying, God has no place in your lifestyle. And he's saying this is what takes place here. They don't consider the operation of his hands. God doesn't have a place at all in their life. Now, the person who first thing in the morning has to drink and desires to party is lost and in bondage. And that's the point he's making. Now, the Bible in Proverbs 20, verse 1 says, wine is a mocker, strong drink a brawler, and whoever is led astray by it's not wise. And that's true. Because if the first thing you're looking for in the morning is a drink, you're a slave to drinking. Now in verse 13, he continues and says, therefore my people have gone into captivity because they have no knowledge. Their honorable men are famished, and their multitude dried up with thirst. Therefore Sheol has enlarged itself and opened its mouth beyond measure. Their glory and their multitude and their pomp, and he who is jubilant shall descend into it. People shall be brought down, each man shall be humbled, and the eyes of the lofty shall be humbled. But the Lord of hosts shall be exalted in judgment, and God, who is holy, shall be hallowed in righteousness. Then the lambs shall feed in their pasture, and in the waste places of the fat ones strangers shall eat. So when he says in verse 13, therefore my people have gone into captivity because they have no knowledge, their honorable men are famished, the multitude dried up with thirst, the bottom line is that they don't have any concern for the things of the Lord, and they have no knowledge of his ways. And it's not that they simply don't have information, it's that they have no depth of faith and experience, because God's word to them isn't important. It's something that they have never believed in or acted upon. You know, there are a lot of people, in other words, who will say, yeah, I'm a Christian, but God's word means nothing to them. They don't read the word of God, and to go to a Bible study, you got to be kidding. To study the Bible, why would I do that? I believe in God, isn't that enough? And yet, this is what he's saying. He said they have no knowledge. See, knowledge in the Bible is not simply a knowledge or a grabbing of information. It's not an accumulation of information. Knowledge in the Bible, when rightly used, is a changed way of life, because you've taken that knowledge and applied it to yourself, and it's changed the way that you live. And so when you have knowledge of God, it's not just that, oh, I know there's a God, because there's a lot of people who say that. The average American will say, oh, I believe there's a God. As a matter of fact, atheism is very small in the United States. There are very few people in the United States who would actually say that they're an atheist. The majority of people would say, if they were saying they had doubts of any sort, they would say they're agnostic. Now, the word agnostic simply means without knowledge. But the Greek, agnostic, without knowledge, has kind of like a snobby feel to it, doesn't it? When you're talking, well, I'm an agnostic. You know, that has kind of, but the Latin, closest translation in Latin is ignoramus. And very few people would say, that's true. Very few people would say, I'm an ignoramus. It sounds better in the Greek than Latin. But we like to use the Greek, so we'll say, well, I'm an agnostic. I really have no certain knowledge. I don't know how you can believe these things or have understanding of these things. And God is saying these people have no practical application of the knowledge that I have given to them. They have seen it as being worthless. They haven't put it into any practice. And as a result of that, they live lives that are foolish. And unfortunately, they're not blessed. In Hosea chapter 4, verse 6, Hosea put it this way, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you've rejected knowledge, I will also reject you from being priest for me. Because you've forgotten the law of your God, I also will forget your children. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Now when he goes on in verses 14 through 16, and he says Sheol has enlarged itself. Sheol is another picture of the grave. The word Sheol in Hebrew has more than one connotation. Sheol is the grave. It can also be another word for eternal judgment. And the point he's making is, with no concern for the Lord, you're going to find yourself swallowed up in death and misery. Psalm 9, verse 17 says, the wicked shall be turned into hell, and all the nations that forget God. And so he's saying, if you're turning your back on me, if your appetites are always filling yourself with drink and food in your party life, well, there's a place waiting for you that is never satisfied, and that's a place called hell. And if you think your appetites are something, the grave's appetite is even greater than your own. And when you turn your back on God, then you end up going into the grave, into misery and ultimate judgment. And that's what he's saying here. Now notice verse 17. He says, then the lambs shall feed in their pasture, and in the waste places of the fat ones strangers shall eat. The fat ones can also speak of those who are very wealthy. In the waste places of those who are living opulent and affluent lifestyles, strangers shall eat. What are you saying? Well, I'm saying this. I'm saying that you had great and beautiful houses, but they're going to become ruins. Those wonderful homes that you built, multiple stories and multiple square feet, thousands of square feet, that were so expensive, so opulent, and you had so many parties in, well, when I bring judgment on you, they'll be abandoned. And when these incredible homes are abandoned, and there's no longer human population there, then as is the way of all of human construction, it's going to go into a state of disrepair and decay. And ultimately, what's going to take place is instead of having all your friends there partying, there are going to be herds that will be walking through and grazing on your land. They'll even walk into your front room where you used to have so much fun, and they're going to be just resting in there. So all of your affluence ends up with absolutely nothing. God is going to replace all your frantic partying with the quietness of flocks grazing. Now, he goes on in verse 18. Isn't this encouraging? Verse 18 and 19. Woe to those who draw iniquity with cords of vanity and sin as if with a cart rope, that say, let him make speed and hasten his work that we may see it. And let the counsel of the Holy One of Israel draw near and come that we may know it. You know what that is? And I've seen this, and perhaps so have you. I am assuming that you have. As is common when affluence increases, along with affluence comes cynicism. When somebody's really wealthy, when everything you want, you can buy. And I freak out on that, to be honest with you, because you want to know something? You know, all of us, and I thank God that we have medium income, frankly. Because what would you do? Now, some people say, well, give me a chance to find out. But what would you do if you had, and I really don't know where his personal wealth is anymore, but he's the most famous. There was a time when I read that Bill Gates had personal wealth that was $92 billion. That's a lot of money. See, but we hear that so much we don't know what that means, do we? $92 billion. We don't know what that means. That's more than entire country's gross national product. $92 billion. This is a person who can walk into any stores in the United States. And he doesn't have to say, I want that jacket there and I want that pair of shoes. He can just walk into the store and say, I want your store. And I want it all. He can walk into any dealer in the world. You know, there is no such thing as price with the man who's got $92 billion. There's no haggling. Do you think right now he's worried because gas prices are so high? I don't think so. You know what I'm saying? This is a person who can buy anything his eye sees, anything his heart desires. Now, that's $92 billion. So somebody says, well, you know, $1 billion would be cool. And you know what? $1 billion is a lot of money too, isn't it? $1,000 million. You couldn't spend $1,000 million in your lifetime. You can live off the interest and live in a filthy rich way. But what comes with money? Well, not too many people become humble because they have a lot. As a matter of fact, I've seen the opposite. Have you? I've seen when somebody has money, they change. They stop treating people the way they used to. They stop being decent and courteous. As a matter of fact, because I've got so much money in my wallet, you have to do what I say, and if you don't, I'll get you fired because I've got so much money. And your boss knows I do, that if you don't give me good service, I'll complain and you'll get fired on the spot. I've got that kind of money. And affluence produces not only that, but it produces a pride and it produces a self-indulgence, and it can also produce a cynicism. Because you're saying, what do I need? If my child is ill, I take him to the best doctor. I'm never really hungry because I have more than one refrigerator and it's always full. I don't have to worry about anything. And affluence does produce, sometimes greatly, cynicism. And you know what's happening here? They're saying, well, if God's going to do this, then let him get busy. How come he hasn't done it? I'm challenging him to do it, and let him do it now. Notice what he's saying again. They say in verse 19, let him make speed and hasten his work, that we may see it. You think there's going to be judgment? Well, come on, bring it on. That's what they're saying. And let the counsel of the Holy One of Israel draw near and come, that we may know it. There's a cynicism there. They think that they're greater than God. Their comforts and finances have caused them to think that they don't even need him. It reminds me of Jeremiah 15, Jeremiah 17:15 that says, "Indeed they say to me, where's the word of the Lord? Let it come now." But remember what Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 and 4. The Apostle Peter writing said, "Knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lusts and saying, where's the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation." You said Jesus is going to come back. We've been waiting. He hasn't made it. That's a scoffer's attitude. That's the mentality. But he goes on in 2 Peter in chapter 3, verse 9 to say, "The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some count slackness, but is long-suffering toward us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance." He's saying, listen, God has not sent his Son to deal with you because he's patient with you, because his desire is for you to get right with him so that you don't go to hell. And so rather than shaking your puny little fist at him, you ought to bend your knee before him because he's been patient with you. Now this one, verse 20 and 21, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight." Now that's an interest. If that doesn't fit into what we see today, I don't know what does. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil. He's denouncing those who mock God and his ways. We see this today, don't we? We see today where people are taking lifestyles, now listen carefully, lifestyles that have been declared to be immoral and accepted as immoral. Listen, accepted as immoral. And we're living in a time right now. And somebody says, "Oh, you sound like a preacher." Thank you. We live in a time now where good is evil spoken of and evil is the norm. That's how we're living right now. We are living that way right now. I'm 50 years old, so I've seen something. Thank you very much. I've seen something. I've seen in my lifetime things flip-flop. I have seen in the generation I came from things just absolutely turn upside down. Blows my mind. So today, homosexuality is not looked at as being anything wrong. As a matter of fact, it's just now the way I was born or defined as a sexual preference. Alcoholism, which has always been recognized as sinful and has been recognized as being something that we choose to enter into. And by the way, some would disagree with that today, but remember with me that alcohol, if it's going to be classified as a disease, is the one disease that you pay a sales tax on and you have to be 21 to get. But what we end up with in our time is people saying it's a disease. So we have a tendency of redefining. There was a time when if somebody was living with somebody else, that was looked at by the society as immoral. And now it's simply a choice that we make, and why can't we do it? It's just our preference. Fornication was looked at as sinful and wrong, but now it's called making love. Pornography is something that people frowned on, and now it's freedom of the press. Profanity was something that there were laws and sections and codes about. I can still remember going to a Jack in the Box down the street from my house, and they had a big sign there, and it said, according to section so-and-so and the municipal code, profanity is illegal, and we will prosecute you for swearing in our restaurant. That, come on now. I mean, you turn on your television, and it's normal conversation. I was reading something, perhaps some of you are familiar with this. I was reading something, there's a show that's called Friends, and I was reading something about them, and a couple of things. And one was that there's one of the characters' name is Monica, the other is Chandler. And they were having, I guess, a discussion sometime in some recent episode. I'm not quite sure when this took place. But apparently they were discussing whether or not they were going to get married. But they made a choice, and the choice that they had made, at least in this show, was that they wouldn't get married. They'd simply live together. And the conclusion, apparently, was a lot of applause from the audience because they thought that's the best choice. And that's the kind of the social milieu that we now are entering into, where people have redefined light and say that light is darkness and darkness is light. That's why the biggest virtue in the United States today isn't the Christian virtues. The largest, the most popular virtue today that we have is the virtue of tolerance. That's what's taking place. Now, in spite of all that, I went to a local coffee shop recently, and I was buying a cup of coffee for my wife and me, and the young man behind the counter had a T-shirt on, and the T-shirt, and he's an employee of this coffee shop, and all, he didn't own it. I know the owner. And his T-shirt said, "Let's get one thing straight, I'm not." And I thought I misread it, to be honest with you. So I'm looking at it. Then I realized if I kept looking too long, you might get the wrong idea. And I thought that's pretty interesting that you would, parade that. Normally, employees are supposed to wear something that's inoffensive to customers. That's just wise business. And yet he was very brazen about it. I didn't say anything to him. I didn't feel like debating him. But I'll tell you, I read recently about a 16-year-old student named Elliot Chambers at Woodbury High School in Minnesota, who was told by his principal that he couldn't wear his Straight Pride sweatshirt because it offended the homosexual students. And the same school has what you call safe rooms for homosexual students that are identified by inverted pink triangles, the universal symbol of homosexuality. So on the one hand, you can have homosexual on campus who are protected interests, but somebody who says, "I have straight pride," is offending. You know what? The light is now dark and the dark is now light. Absolutely. Absolutely. Is this just going to happen then or in the future? It's happening now. It's happening now. But what does God say? He says, "Woe to you." The word woe, of course, speaks of judgment upon you for this. You're twisting everything and you're allowing anything to go. And God says, "No, I will bring judgment to you." Woe, he says in verse 21, to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. Verse 22, woe to men mighty at drinking wine. Woe to men valiant for mixing intoxicating drink, who justify the wicked for a bribe and take away justice from the righteous man. These Jewish leaders are open to receiving bribes. They drink and they have problems with their alcohol, and therefore the money that comes in, they're no longer using sober judgment, and as a result, they're able to be bribed. I was speaking to somebody just yesterday who does a lot of ministry in Washington. And they were saying to me that in their ministry there in Washington, one of the greatest problems that they see amongst our elected officials is alcoholism. One of the greatest problems. And let me give you something very quickly here for you to pray about. I'm right now being presented in, I don't know how to put this, I'm being given an opportunity in the next few months to go to Washington, D.C., to be one of 4 Hispanic speakers to a national pastors conference to share with them concerning ministry and all of that. So pray about that, because I was invited just yesterday to go to D.C. and to meet with the National Hispanics in a National Hispanics Conference. I said, why? Why? Because that's on my heart. I desire to say, come on, guys, let's get it together. And I've been praying for the longest time, and now I was given the opportunity yesterday. Plus, I was also given an invitation to potentially go to meet with some of the national leaders about the faith-based thing coming out from the President Bush. They want to get some of what they call national leaders, and apparently they think, because I'm on the radio, that I can go. And so they're asking if I'll go and join them with Chuck Colson and Charles Swindoll and several of the other leaders throughout the United States. What an honor, what a privilege, and what an opportunity to be given to do something like that. And I'm looking forward to that. And I said, of course, just send me a plane ticket and put me up in one of those big houses. But I really believe that we need to be very careful, because there is a wisdom that people have, but they're wise in their own eyes. And also, there are people who are mighty, he says, at drinking, but not anything else. So what happens? Verse 24, therefore, as the fire devours the stubble, and the flame consumes the chaff, so the root will be as rottenness, Their blossom will ascend like dust, because they have rejected the law of the Lord of hosts and despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. Therefore, the anger of the Lord is aroused against his people. He has stretched out his hand against them and stricken them, and the hills trembled. Their carcasses were as refuse in the midst of the street. For all this, his anger is not turned away. His hand is stretched out still. So he's saying, because they have disregarded God's ways, revealed through his word, God is bringing judgment on them. And finally, verse 26 to the conclusion, he will lift up a banner to the nations from afar and will whistle to them from the end of the earth. Surely they shall come with speed swiftly. No one will be weary or stumble among them. No one will slumber or sleep, nor will the belt of their loins be loosed, nor the strap of their sandal be broken, whose arrows are sharp and their bows bent. Their horses' hooves will seem like flint, their wheels like a whirlwind. Their roaring will be like a lion. They'll roar like young lions. They will roar and lay hold of the prey. They will carry it away safely. No one will deliver. In that day they will roar against them like the roaring of the sea. And if one looks to the land, behold, darkness and sorrow, and the light is darkened by the clouds. And so he's saying God's judgment is coming. And he pictures it like that, in that incredible imagery. And God's judgment did begin. Remember with me that he began his ministry in around 740. In 722, Assyria came down and devastated the 10 northern tribes. In 605, Babylon came down. And 597 and 586 under Nebuchadnezzar, and took the last two tribes in the south, Judah and Benjamin. And they were dispersed and they were scattered throughout the face of the earth. And he's saying, my judgment is coming. If you disregard what I have to say, then the only thing left for you is my judgment. I will destroy, but not completely. We'll pick this up next time at chapter 6.